Good morning. My name is Casey Douma. I am from the Pueblo of Laguna, as well as Hopi Tewa. I was raised in the Pueblo of Laguna, went to elementary school, Head Start, middle school, I'm up there. Like many of you all, I'm an attorney, as well as the co-chair of the All Pueblo Council of Governors Redistricting Committee. I had the fortunate experience of 10 years ago being able to represent the multi-tribal plaintiffs in the litigation. Some of you, I recall some familiar faces in the room here, and certainly thankful for this process this time around. We see throughout the history of redistricting, the engagement of tribal leadership and Pueblo leadership as being the focal point of our efforts. So 10 years ago, as the Pueblo leadership engaged in this process, as we recall the history of redistricting, some of which the critique was in the past sessions where legislative committees would take the show on the road, get input, and not use that input. So when we think about how engaging this process is this time around, we're very thankful for your commitment, the time you take away from your families to be here with us, to hear the concerns of the citizens of this state. And so to understand the Pueblo leadership's redistricting efforts is to take a little walk through history. Because to understand where our people are at, the boundaries of our reservations, our connections to ancestral homelands, our brothers and sisters who now occupy and live in urban communities, all of that has been impacted through policy and law throughout the years. So to understand the concepts of self-determination, the concepts of voting rights, and understand that what will be eventually the maps that we propose to the committee, it's important to take a look at the efforts of history to disenfranchise Native people from voting. So as Pueblo leadership has expressed, this collective effort of moving together, walking together collectively, that has been the goal of the redistricting process. 10 years ago, that was the goal. So you can imagine 20 plus sovereign government trying to make a decision, trying to come to a consensus around a set of maps. And that's a hard task. That's a very hard task in any setting. But the commitment made by each of the leadership was to ensure that they spoke with a collective voice, that the vetting of the issues, to understand what the ramifications are for every boundary modification. The Pueblo leadership 2000 and 2011 was very attentive, as well as today. And so when we think about the importance of history, and if we can go to the next slide, the concept of federal policy. When we look at why there's a lot of urban Indian population in the cities. You take, for example, Laguna Pueblo with close to 9,000 members, half of them living off the reservation. That's a direct consequence of a lot of policies that have been in place that were intent to remove our peoples from our traditional homelands. So we take a quick step through federal policy and we start looking at the evolution of tribal governance in the more modern context. You know, we have this underscore here in New Mexico of the colonial history. But even in that colonial history, you will find that Pueblo leaders have engaged in the processes at hand. At that time, they were called the protectors of the Indians within Spanish law that allowed for Pueblo leadership to advocate to that particular body. So you see, going all the way back to the 1600s, Pueblo leadership advocating in those settings, in using the law to achieve their objectives, to secure the protection of their homelands. And so Pueblo leadership is engaged in these types of processes. They're very adaptive to the processes at hand. And so if we look back to early Indian removal era, we understand that the policy of removal of tribal peoples from their homelands impacted so many people across this country. Here in New Mexico, the Pueblos remain in the homelands in which they were first more contacted with, for the most part. The other side of the spectrum is that many Pueblos that once existed are no longer here. So the connections to our homelands, our ancestral homelands, and you'll hear those words coming from our governors today, of the connections to various places that are no longer inside our reservation boundaries. And that's very important because many of the issues that we advocate on are issues that pertain to things that fall outside those reservation boundaries. So oftentimes we can get boxed in as Native people to issues that are only within our reservation boundaries. But as you will see and you'll hear from leadership today, there are many issues that extend beyond those boundaries. And so when we look at this reservation period, we begin to think about the type of voice that Native people had to engage. At this time, Native people were not considered citizens of the United States government. And so you think about the types of history and the types of culture of engaging into the political process, it certainly hasn't been there, from the onset of this country. Fast forward into this assimilation era. Governor Vial spoke just a while ago about the history of removing children from their communities through the boarding school process. Just right across the road was the Albuquerque Indian School. My grandmother went to school there. Many others went to school there as well. And that process of removing the Indianness from Native children was the policy at that time. Removing them from the homelands, from the comforts of home, to disassociate them from the communal nature of our communities. That had a real impact on our people. And one of the other things you saw as a side effect, though, is you saw a lot of intertribal relationships happen there, where, before you had relationships with just your own people, you knew who was there from Laguna Pueblo and Acoma Pueblo. When you started going to boarding school, things happened, right? And all of a sudden, my grandma's from Acoma, my grandfather's from Laguna. Or in my case, my mother's side, Laguna Pueblo, my dad's side, Hopi Taylor from Arizona, as a product of boarding schools. And so you see the development of our communities begin to shape where our relationships, those ancient ancestral relationships, begin to grow even more as a byproduct of that era. And we look to, at this time period of assimilation, 1924 is when the United States granted citizenship to Native people. So it wasn't until 1924 in which the Indian Citizenship Act provided citizenship to Native people. But that did not come with the right to vote for many Native people. Here in New Mexico, that did not transpire until 1948. And even in some cases until 1962. And so those circumstances of building that tradition of voting is not within the collective memory of many of our own grandparents. That was something that was not a part of the culture as well within our own communities, because in New Mexico, very uniquely, many of our Pueblo governments still have those traditional forms of government, those traditional forms of leadership, as you see the individuals in this room, where it's not like a county election. It's not like a city election or a federal election. It's this very special practice of appointments being made, a selection of leaders. So even within Pueblo communities, you're not having an active engagement of voting for a leader. And so you begin to understand in some communities why it's difficult to get voter engagement into our communities. And you compound that with the disenfranchisement of Native vote, and you can see where we have evolved from that time. So when we began to look at that era of the Indian Reorganization Act, where finally, after coming through this assimilation period, where the destabilization of Native communities was the goal, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 began this acknowledgement of tribal governance that the Pueblo governors that you see here who have a legacy of governing since time immemorial, for the longest time, despite having some of the longest lasting governments, weren't giving the full acknowledgement until 1930s. And you see, out of that type of leadership, we've had many great leaders advocate on behalf of our people. And so, as federal policy goes, it shifts. And though we came from an era of Indian reorganization, of acknowledging tribal governance, we moved into the termination era in the 50s, where the goal is the federal government, let us move away from this federal trust responsibility. Let's remove that special status from tribal governments, with the end goal of more loss of land from our tribal communities, less respect for tribal sovereignty. And also in this era of termination was what he called the Indian Relocation Program, where you see now you have high populations of urban Native communities in cities like Albuquerque, Gallup, Dallas, Denver, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, where the goal of that policy was to encourage Native people to move away from the communities. That the sooner you leave your communities, the better they are. And so what spawned out throughout that time period was a huge increase in urban Native populations that still remains for a large part today, those strongholds of those cities like Denver, like Albuquerque, where you have a huge Native population within those cities. And so policy impacted that. And as we move into another era of the shifting federal policy of self-determination, we begin to see the federal government take another look of acknowledging that tribes know what's best for their own people, that the failed experiments of dictating to tribal governments on behalf of the federal government what the federal government felt was in their best interest was constantly failing throughout the country. And the acknowledgement that tribal governments, tribal leadership knew what was best for their people. So this era of self-determination, the acknowledgement of tribal communities to make decisions upon themselves is something that we are riding that wave continuously. So as federal policy has shifted, tribal leaders have still maintained a strong stance on asserting that their ability, that self-determination, the ability to make decisions on behalf of their people, that they know what's best for their people, is something that's very crucial to our leadership. And it was very fundamental 10 years ago through the redistricting process. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. This concept of sovereignty being a pretty common term you'll hear from time to time amongst tribal leadership. But the acknowledgement of tribes as sovereign nations is built into federal law. And that's something that oftentimes we often contend with when you hear, why do tribes, it's often quoted like they get special treatment, treating them as though they're some special interest groups, when the foundation of federal law has acknowledged that the relationship between the federal government, tribal governments, is one that's based on this mutual respect of sovereign to sovereign, government to government relations. And so, we look to that history of seeing also the United States Supreme Court, because one of the critiques that we often hear as tribal governments is, well, they're given special treatment because it's a racial preference. But what has been acknowledged through time is the political nature of the relationship between tribal governments and the federal governments, as well as the relationship to state governments. So the relationship between the states and tribes has not always been good, as we can recall that history. Oftentimes federal courts, the United States Supreme Court, will often cite that relationship as hostile, characterizing the states as some of the tribe's worst enemies, given the types of laws that were attempted to be applied to tribal governments and Native people. So that relationship has gone through many factors. And here in New Mexico, you can see the proactive nature of Pueblo governments has really begun to shift that type of relationship into a more positive light. as more representation has been available to our people. So it correlates, the policies of the state correlate to the types of individuals we have in those seats of representation. And so we begin to look at just being thankful for the folks who we have in the room here. We have Native representatives, Native senators, a thing we couldn't say a couple decades ago. And that's something that has been able to transform the relationship between the state government, as well as now in the federal government, where we have one of our own sitting at the cabinet secretary. And so if we can move to your next slide, please. This concept of self-determination, consultation, and informed consent, this is built into federal law. So when tribes are advocating this strong commitment to consultation, to working collaboratively, it's because they have a history of this type of relationship. Like 2009, the State Tribal Collaboration Act provided that type of mandate to state agencies to consult with tribal governments, to be at the forefront, even requiring the governor of the state to meet with tribal governments. So that was a reflection of a larger federal policy of consultation that we see, and tribal governments engage with federal agencies on a daily basis in these types of consultations, because the acknowledgement is that the actions that impact tribes, we need to know from tribal leadership how those ramifications will impact. And so tribal leadership is engaged constantly into these types of sessions of consultation. And sometimes they are not meaningful. Sometimes the invitation is there, but the input is not taken in. And so we have that I would say that third eye of really engaging and making sure the process is meaningful, so that the input that is being submitted is being addressed and really taken seriously. And that was the approach 10 years ago into the redistricting process, was to really engage, because the maps that were going to be proposed, tribal leadership wanted to know that if they put their stamp of approval on a consensus map, that it had gone through many filters of decision-making, negotiations, analysis, those types of due diligence that satisfied not only the Voting Rights Act and the redistricting principles, but also met the needs of each pueblo and each tribe. And so to understand this concept of self-determination, consultation, and consent, that's a forefront of engagement with tribal leadership, something that is very sacred in a sense. And we can move to the next slide. So when we think about tribal nations today, we think about the many types of issues that we have to address. And the leadership today will be expressing to you those types of issues and the ways they collaborate with one another, the ways we collaborate with other tribes, that links our lands to one another, that links our communities together. Because often if you just look at the map and look at tribal lands, you might not see the connections. A tribe up here may be too far for another tribe to be connected. But as you'll hear from the leadership today, those connections are very obvious. They've been historical as well as current. And so just looking at a map of tribal lands would not give you all of the types of connections that many of our leadership will elaborate on today. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So we think about communities of interest. Pueblo communities are very diverse, as mentioned. We're farmers, or ranchers, or basketball players, or doctors, or lawyers. We have all of those components within our communities. We have economic development on one level and economic development on a lower level. There's many facets to our communities that link each other together. And because we've been in this area since time immemorial, our connections to other communities as well still remain strong. You talk to an old Pueblo rancher, and they'll tell you about the relationship with different Navajo communities when they were younger, and even till today, around ranching activities. You talk with folks in our communities, and they'll tell you their friends in the local land grant communities that they went to school with and grew up with and played basketball and baseball with and football. Those types of relationships still are very strong because as communities, at some point you have to realize we have to work together. On some issues, we are very supportive, and then some issues can be divisive, and we see those from time to time. And tribal leadership has that duty of trying to manage those relationships. So, in one particular picture down here on the lower left is a feast day picture. And, many of you are aware of the Pueblo feast days that happen. And for example, in the Pueblo of Laguna, there's a certain area on the other side of the hill there where prior to the feast day, days before, Navajo people would come, and that's where they would make their camp. Prior to the feast day, they would go trade. Pueblo farmers would go take melons and corns, and they would have sheep, and they would trade, and they have this whole relationship building. Year after year, they would formalize those relationships and strengthen those bonds and continue those relationships. Many of you know and have experienced those feast day, our feast day activities will know the enduring relationships that continue just based upon that one day, that one opportunity to connect communities together. Pueblo people are very welcoming people in that sense. That's one of our core values of being welcoming, of being open to feed someone when they come to the door, to be able to make sure that they're taken care of while they're in our presence. Those are some enduring Pueblo values that have really allowed our communities to work together, to see issues collectively. And so, as you will hear from the leadership today, those types of issues, when it comes time to advocate the relationships and the bonds that have been existing for generations, they're able to pick up right at that point and move forward. And so those values of Pueblo communities are very much evident in our everyday life. So when we think about Pueblo communities, this is just a brief overview of the tribes in New Mexico and tribal lands. And like I mentioned, if one was not familiar with our communities, just looking at the map, you would say, well, there's huge gaps in these areas. And obviously these communities are not connected. That's too far to be, they're too far north to be there. But as you'll hear today, the connections that we have they transcend these reservation boundaries. They extend not only within the state of New Mexico, but they extend to many other different states. And that's the extent of the connection that we have to places and people. You move to the next slide. So when we think of the Pueblo languages, the very important languages that you hear being spoken today, then the commitment to maintaining those language, the linkages of the Caras Pueblos, the Tewa Pueblos, Tiwa Pueblos, Towa Pueblos, and the Zuni Pueblo, those linguistic connections that we have with one another, that shared language is also one of those connecting features that we have amongst ourselves, where those relationships built on language and our connection to one another has been forged throughout the years. And oftentimes they have a shared history with one another. So there was a time in Pueblo history where the movements and the migrations were very fluid. And so we have a lot of history with one another, whether it's through clans, whether it's stories of people that once came from this particular Pueblo and now lives in this Pueblo. Those stories are very relevant in our modern day history. And we look at the different types of organizations surrounded by that kind of form these Pueblo alliances, the All Pueblo Councils of Governors who are here today and represented, the 5 Sandoval Indian Pueblos, the 8 Northern Indian Pueblos Council. All of those organizations work for the benefit of Pueblo people and are focused on different regional areas. And there's other organizations worth noting, the Apache Alliance, which also is formed from the different Apache tribes, not only in New Mexico, but in Arizona and Oklahoma. Those are organizations that transcend boundaries and transcend states, as well as the National Congress of American Indians, in which many of the Pueblos here are engaged in on national advocacy efforts. So when it comes to Native issues, borders and boundaries of that nature really don't mean much. the issues at hand, the advocacy will transcend boundaries, whether it's county boundaries, state boundaries, or even national boundaries, with our brothers and sisters up north, Canada, south into Mexico and South America. Those connections are being made constantly. So when we think about voting rights and kind of what brings us here today, this history of Mr. Miguel Trujillo from Isleta Pueblo, we talked about Native people only getting the right to vote in 1948. If you think about the history of Mr. Miguel Trujillo, a veteran who fought for his country, now coming back and wants to exercise his right to vote and is told that he cannot vote because the Constitution of the state of New Mexico bars him from voting due to a provision that basically said that Indians not taxed cannot vote. And so fortunately, the court at that time did not buy into that argument that Native people were not allowed to vote. And so Miguel Trujillo really has to be honored for the commitment he made to securing that right to vote for Native people. And so when we think about what has transpired since then, there's still been these practices of voter disenfranchisement that occurs. And we think about more recently, when we think about 1948, the Miguel Trujillo, and then 1962, those cases regarding Navajo people that also questioned their ability to vote in state elections. And the very important part, and to reiterate, is the history in the culture that's built up in so many people and so many families of voting as a tradition is one that hasn't been afforded to many Native people in this state. And so building that momentum to get in voter engagement initiatives, building the momentum to really engage our communities is something that's ongoing. We don't have generations of that established. It's very infancy. And many of the folks in this room have been engaged in our communities and can share with you those types of history of how Pueblo people have felt disenfranchised from the process. And so when we think about it, 10 years ago when we were going through this redistricting process, there was two counties still under consent decree from DOJ, Cibola County and Sandoval County. So at that time, the history of a lot of these counties was not providing viable access to Native American voters. And so whether that came in the form of translators in the Native language, or just having the ability to do basic voter registration, those types of problems resulted in consent decrees. We all understand the nature of what happened with the Voting Rights Act in 2013. So those types of consent decrees are no longer in play, but still the need to protect Native American voting rights is still very much at the forefront of not only here in New Mexico, but as you can see nationwide. The state of Arizona next door to us passing legislation that makes it difficult for Native people to vote. The voter ID laws that are happening in the state of Montana that are restricting many Native people who don't have an address, a street address to their homes. And like many of our communities, we didn't get street addresses till just a couple, maybe a decade ago. Everybody used the PO box. That goes the same way in a lot of rural communities in Indian country. And so we still have that dilemma at the forefront, and we can see direct correlation to the types of contributions Native people have made to the electoral process, where they become a decisive factor in elections. And so we can see the Arizona having a direct result of the Native population voting shifted the election outcome. And so we see those things correspond, and it's hard to those types of incidents away from how tribes look at redistricting and seeing what types of challenges that we have in front of us. So when we think about this process and we think about 2001, and we really have to give credit to Hickory Apache, who is here today, Hickory Apache Nation, for really holding that fire with Navajo Nation back in 2001, as well as in 2011. Their momentum really gave rise to many of the Pueblos engaging in 2011. And when we think about this process is based on consensus building, as mentioned. The legislative session, that was a very intense process. We understood in 2011 the very political nature of the redistricting process, that even though the sessions were happening throughout the state, we understood where the decisions were being made in Santa Fe regarding those maps. So Pueblo leadership knew that's where they had to be. They had to be in those meetings and pushing their maps based and on solid foundation with the Voting Rights Act and those traditional redistricting principles. That was something that the Pueblo leadership understood. If we can base our maps and tie them to the Voting Rights Act and those traditional redistricting principles, we know that we have strong footing to stand on. So there was many proposals coming from different places, and sometimes they didn't mesh with our analysis of the Voting Rights Act and those traditional redistricting principles. And the leadership knew that was not going to be a good approach to take. So that filtering process, the decision-making process, that consensus building process, factored in all of those elements into the decision. And so those are something that was very important. And so when the case went from the legislative session into court, big decisions were made of who was going to step up to carry that fight into the court. The Pueblo of Zuni, the Pueblo of Acoma, the Pueblo of Laguna, the Pueblo of Isleta, the Pueblo of Santa Ana, the Hickory Apache, all stepped up with the guidance coming also from the All Pueblo Council of Governors at that time, collectively being engaged in that process, because they knew that the ripple effect of the 6 Pueblos and the Hickory Apache being involved in that would impact all the tribes in the area. So collectively, still during the litigation, they walked together. And so if you think about the fast-paced nature of redistricting, of how responsive communities have to be to the proposed maps that are being submitted, it was a very fast process for a lot of Pueblo leadership. They had to adapt their own decision-making processes to meet the need of the redistricting pace. And so they were very disciplined in that process. And that, I think, this time around is very critical, is to understand the process of Pueblo decision-making. It is very thorough, very engaged. And one thing that's very important, and a lesson learned from 2011, both in the legislative session and the litigation session, is because redistricting is so polarized around Democrats, Republicans, and the partisan language that's thrown around, tribes don't speak in that language. They don't speak in terms of Democrat, Republican. Their issues resonate. They're looking for candidates that will respond to their issues. They're looking for candidates that will respond to their needs when it pertains to our lands, our waters, and our people. And so that was very different for the discussions that were happening in the legislature. That was very different for the discussions happening in litigation, because the assumption was, well, tribes are just going to be for this political party, so we're not going to really engage with you because we already know where you want to stand. And tribal leadership was there thinking, if they only knew, we don't see in those terms. You know, we can, if there is a candidate that's willing to support this issue, we're going to engage with them, because oftentimes our communities don't have the luxury of engaging in that type of political discourse that's very divisive. They have to provide results for their people because it's that important. So that's a very important thing to understand, that when Pueblo leadership is looking through the lens of redistricting, they're looking at those who can respond to their needs. And that's very consistent with the nonpartisan nature of your analysis that you have before you. And that's something that's very critical to our Pueblo leadership. So when we think about, this whole process, think about that the end game that we think about as Native people and having representation. What better example than to highlight one of our very own, Deborah Holland from Laguna Pueblo, who's from where I grew up. I went to law school with Deborah Holland, and seeing her make her entryway with voter engagement, registering people to vote, and eventually leading to this process of her now having a cabinet secretary position. That is the hopes of many of our people, is to find that type of representation of those people who know our communities, those people that can understand our issues. Oftentimes, we've had to rely on folks that maybe don't have those shared interests, and we try to make connections just as much as we can. But the benefit of having districts where the percentages of the voting age population of Native people can help us elect the candidate of our choice, that is something that's very critical as an outcome. And the Pueblo leadership understands that we're trying to create opportunities to elect candidates that can respond to our issues. And so what you'll hear today from our leadership is not only how our communities are connected, where they see their communities of interest, but also the responsive nature of the representatives that we do have, the responsiveness to our issues, and sometimes the frustration they have in going through this political process of having to constantly educate a leader on issues that are very much of high importance. And so thinking about the strategy, and one thing that is important to convey is this decision-making process. There are many people that will propose maps. They'll propose different types of maps that maybe do not take into consideration what's in the best interest of Native people. And the Pueblo leadership understands that they have also a duty to advocate and let you know whether those maps are not the best interest of Pueblo people and Native people. And so in conclusion, what is essential for this time we have today is to help you understand that our connections, our issues transcend our reservation boundaries. Our issues are based upon a firm understanding of our own core values that prompt us to advocate for the things that mean everything to us: language, education for our children, protection of areas sacred to us. All of that you'll hear today from our Pueblo leadership and how they convey the importance of these areas. And so when we looked at 10 years ago, when we looked at districts, at that time, there was very political issues happening. On Mount Taylor, there was the influx of interest of uranium mining. And so we saw maps being proposed that would isolate Mount Taylor away from a district that had Laguna and Acoma, right? That were right at the base of the mountain. Pueblo leadership advocated very strongly that those were not in our best interest, that they wanted to be in a district that had Mount Taylor in their district because that mountain was sacred. Different areas of significance will be important for our Pueblo communities, and they'll convey that to you, which areas are important to them. So you'll see that those areas are what they're factoring in when they have the boundaries that they submit to the committee. The thing that's different this time around, we're still getting the data and getting the ability to really dice up the numbers according to everything that's going to be supplied. So the negotiation process of tribal leadership is still ongoing. There's still, once those numbers come in and we can really dig into them, there's going to be a lot more decisions being made and discussions. The leadership has made that commitment, though, to be engaged in this process. And so if there's anything to convey, is that when you receive the maps from Pueblo leadership and tribal leadership, know that it has been through an extensive process of decision making. And that is a part of the culture of tribal leadership, the culture of really deliberating intentionally and talking these things through. And it's a beautiful act of governance that many of you, or if you're fortunate to see these types of discussions, you don't hear the partisan nature of the ugly discourse that happened in the community. It's about the issues. It's about the things that mean most to our communities. So I want to thank you all today for this time to share with you. And certainly we offer and extend that hand. If there's any questions you have regarding our communities, we're here to answer those, and we're here to provide you the most information you can to carry out your duties as a committee. So I want to thank you here today.